The stars looked different from this far out, and Ambassador Daniel Price stood at the observation window of Axiom Prime Station, thinking about how far humanity had come in such a short time. Just 5 years ago, humans were alone in the universe, and now he was standing in a station that held representatives from 200 different species. The view was beautiful, but Daniel felt the weight of every decision pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, the council chamber buzzed with quiet conversations in languages that required translation devices to understand. Daniel adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and turned to face the room that would decide humanity's future among the stars. The chamber itself was enormous, built to accommodate species of vastly different sizes and environmental needs. Some representatives floated in tanks of liquid, others stood on platforms adjusted to their gravity preferences, and a few existed as energy patterns contained in specialized fields. Daniel walked to the human delegation's assigned space, a simple platform with a podium and chairs. His team was already there, waiting. Dr. Lisa Cameron gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes tired from 3 days of preliminary meetings. Next to her sat Captain Jake Morrison in his marine dress uniform, the man's posture perfect and his face unreadable. Daniel had specifically requested Jake for this mission because he needed someone who understood both discipline and diplomacy, and Marines seemed to excel at both when the situation required it. The session began with the usual protocols, and Daniel listened as the translator device in his ear converted the opening statements into English. High Counselor Orath, an ancient being whose species lived for centuries, welcomed everyone and outlined the day's agenda. Then came the part Daniel had been dreading. Counselor Vareth, a tall, crystalline figure who seemed to refract light in unsettling ways, rose to present her security analysis of humanity. Daniel had read the preliminary report, and it was not favorable. Vareth's voice came through the translator as cold and clinical. She began listing humanity's history of conflicts, starting with ancient wars and moving through the centuries with methodical precision. The Crusades, the World Wars, regional conflicts, civil wars, genocides, and countless smaller battles that scarred human history. The chamber grew quiet as the list continued, each conflict displayed on holographic screens that surrounded the assembly. When Vareth finished, she turned to face the human delegation directly. Her conclusion was simple and devastating. Humanity was biologically predisposed to violence, their entire civilization built on a foundation of warfare and conflict. She recommended strict limitations on human expansion, mandatory cultural observers, and a prohibition on military vessels beyond Earth's solar system. Several council members voiced their agreement, and Daniel felt his carefully prepared counter-arguments becoming irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming historical evidence. How could he argue against facts? Every war Vareth mentioned had happened, every conflict was real, and the cost in human lives was staggering. He stood slowly, knowing he had to try anyway. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. He acknowledged humanity's violent past, but argued that it did not define their future. He talked about how humans had created the United Nations, established international law, built institutions designed to prevent war rather than wage it. He explained that Earth had gone decades without major conflicts, that cooperation between former enemies was now commonplace, and that humanity had learned from its mistakes. His voice grew stronger as he described how humans had faced their darkest impulses and chosen to build something better. But even as he spoke, Daniel could see the skepticism in the chamber. These beings had removed violence from their nature through genetic modification and cultural evolution. They did not understand choosing peace while retaining the capacity for war. Vareth interrupted him with a question that cut through his argument like a knife. If humanity truly sought peace, why did they maintain military forces? Why did organizations like the United States Marine Corps still exist? Why train soldiers if you have no intention of using them? Daniel opened his mouth to respond but found himself struggling for words that would make sense to beings who had never faced the choice between fighting and surrendering. It was Captain Morrison who spoke next, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the chamber. The Marine stood and every eye in the room turned to him. Jake's face remained calm as he began to speak, and Daniel realized this was why he had brought the captain. Some things could only be explained by those who lived them. Jake explained that Marines existed not because humans loved war, but precisely because they understood its cost. Every Marine knew what violence could do because humanity had paid that price repeatedly throughout its history. They trained for war so that others might live in peace, prepared for conflict so that conflict might be avoided, and maintained strength so that the weak would not be preyed upon. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience. Jake talked about how Marines learned discipline, honor, and the responsibility that came with the power to harm others. He explained that the greatest warriors were those who knew when not to fight, who understood that true strength meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. The chamber was silent when he finished, but Daniel could not tell if Jake's words had made any difference. The council deliberated for hours, and Daniel spent that time pacing in a waiting area with his team. Lisa tried to remain optimistic, pointing out that several council members had seemed receptive to their arguments. Jake sat quietly, his face thoughtful. When they were finally called back to the chamber, Daniel knew from the atmosphere that the decision was not what he had hoped for. High Counselor Orath delivered the verdict with what might have been sympathy. Humanity was granted provisional membership status, but the restrictions Vareth proposed would remain in place. No military vessels beyond the solar system, no weapons development exceeding current specifications, and mandatory cultural observers who would monitor human society for signs of aggressive expansion. The Council would review humanity's status in 10 years, and only then might the restrictions be lifted. Daniel felt a mix of relief and frustration as he listened to the terms. They had not been rejected outright, but the limitations were essentially a cage. Humanity would be part of galactic civilization in name only, watched like dangerous animals who might turn violent at any moment. He thanked the Council for their consideration and assured them that humanity would abide by their decision. The formal session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber. Lisa looked like she wanted to argue further, but Daniel shook his head. They had done what they could, and pushing harder now would only confirm the Council's fears. Jake remained silent, but Daniel noticed the captain watching the various species with careful attention, as if memorizing everything about how they moved and interacted. The human delegation returned to their assigned quarters on the station, a small suite that felt cramped after the enormous council chamber. Daniel collapsed into a chair and rubbed his tired eyes. They had prepared for months for these negotiations, studied every scrap of information about council politics and procedures, and still they had failed to make the council understand. Lisa sat across from him and started talking about appeals and further negotiations, but Daniel was not listening. He was thinking about the look in Varath's eyes, the absolute certainty that humans were dangerous. How could you convince someone to trust you when your entire history argued against it? Jake stood by the window, looking out at the stars, and Daniel wondered what the Marine was thinking. 3 days passed in a blur of final meetings and farewell ceremonies. The human delegation prepared to depart Axiom Prime and return to Earth with news of their limited success. Daniel spent his time writing reports and preparing briefings for the government officials, who would want to know every detail of the negotiations. Lisa conducted final interviews with xenobiologists from various council species, gathering information that might prove useful in future diplomatic efforts. Jake and his small security detail maintained their professional vigilance, though there was little threat on a station dedicated to peaceful discourse. Everything was routine until the morning they were scheduled to leave. Daniel was reviewing departure protocols when alarms began sounding throughout the station. The noise was strange, a warbling tone that the translator device could not interpret. He looked at Lisa and Jake, seeing his confusion reflected in their faces. Then the station's communication system activated, and High Counselor Orath's voice filled the room. His words were calm, but underneath, Daniel detected something he had never heard from the ancient being before: fear. The counselor announced that long-range sensors had detected an unknown fleet, approaching at high speed. The vessels were not responding to communication attempts, and their trajectory suggested hostile intent. All delegates were ordered to shelter in place while the Council's defense forces investigated. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Daniel standing in the middle of the room with his heart pounding. Jake moved immediately to the room's computer terminal and accessed the station's sensor network. Daniel and Lisa crowded behind him as the first impact threw Daniel against the wall hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Emergency lights flickered on as the main power grid fluctuated, casting everything in a harsh red glow. Jake was already moving, pulling Daniel to his feet while shouting orders to his security detail through his communication device. Lisa grabbed onto a support beam as another impact shook the station, her face pale but determined. Through the window, Daniel could see flashes of light as weapons fire streaked across the void. The unknown ships were attacking with methodical precision, targeting specific points on the station's exterior. Whatever these beings were, they knew exactly what they were doing. Jake led them to the embassy's command center, a small room filled with displays and communication equipment. The Marine activated the tactical screens and Daniel watched in horror as the battle unfolded. The attacking fleet had spread out around Axiom Prime in a pattern that cut off all escape routes. They were destroying sensor arrays, power stations, and communication satellites with brutal efficiency. The station's shields were holding, but each hit weakened them further. Daniel counted 47 attacking vessels on the display, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. Against them, the Council had deployed their defense fleet, a collection of elegant ships that looked more like mobile research stations than military vessels. The mismatch was obvious even to Daniel's untrained eye. The Council ships attempted to intercept the attackers using tactics that seemed logical, but ineffective. They moved in standard patrol formations, broadcast warnings in multiple languages, and fired their weapons with obvious reluctance. The attacking fleet simply ignored them, destroying any Council ship that got too close while continuing their systematic dismantling of the station's defenses. Daniel watched one Council vessel take multiple hits to its shield before finally returning fire. The shots went wide, missing the target by hundreds of meters. The attacking ship responded with a single precise shot that tore through the Council vessel's engine section. The ship went dark and began tumbling away from the battle. Jake's voice was quiet but firm as he watched the display. They do not know how to fight. They really do not know how. Lisa was accessing the station's database, searching for information about the attacking force. She found it buried in historical records from 3,000 years ago. The species was called the Krell, a civilization that had evolved in a resource-scarce system where only the strongest survived. While the Council was developing philosophy and art, the Krell were perfecting warfare. The Council had encountered them once before and barely survived. The Krell had been pushed back to their home system and quarantined there, and the Council assumed they would eventually evolve beyond their violent nature. That assumption was clearly wrong. The Krell had spent 3 millennia preparing for this moment, building their fleet and planning their revenge. Lisa's hands shook as she read the historical accounts. The Krell did not take prisoners and they did not negotiate. They conquered or they destroyed, and there was no middle ground. Another impact rocked the station and Daniel heard screaming through the walls. The Krell were getting closer to breaching the hull. He grabbed the communication device and tried to contact High Counselor Orath, but the signal was jammed. Jake was already accessing the human diplomatic vessel's systems remotely. The ship was small, a converted frigate with a crew of 60 and 30 Marines who had come along as security escorts. Admiral Beth Carter commanded the vessel, and her face appeared on the screen looking grim but composed. She reported that her ship was undamaged but standing off at a safe distance per Council regulations. Her weapon systems were active and her crew was ready, but she could not engage without authorization. Daniel understood the unspoken question in her eyes. If he ordered her to fight, humanity would be violating the Council's restrictions before they had even left the station. If he did nothing, millions would die. Jake stood beside him and spoke quietly so only Daniel could hear. Ambassador, those people out there are dying because they forgot how to defend themselves. We have not forgotten. We trained for this. We prepared for this. Let us do what we came out here to do. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Daniel looked at the tactical display where Council ships were being destroyed one by one. He thought about the delegates he had met over the past weeks, beings from hundreds of worlds who had families and dreams and futures that would end today if someone did not act. He thought about humanity's bloody history, all those wars and conflicts that made the Council fear them. Maybe that history had a purpose. Maybe humans learned to fight so well because someday, somewhere, innocent people would need warriors who remembered how. Daniel made his decision. He activated the direct channel to High Counselor Orath and waited for the connection to establish. When the ancient being's face appeared on the screen, Daniel saw fear there for the first time. The counselor's voice shook as he spoke. admitting that the Council's forces were failing and the station would fall within hours. Daniel interrupted him with a simple question. "Do you authorize the human vessel to engage the attacking force?" Orath was silent for a long moment, and Daniel could see the struggle on the alien face. Everything the Council believed about humanity made this decision dangerous. But everything happening outside the station made it necessary. Finally, Orath spoke the words that changed everything. "Yes, in the name of the Galactic Council, I authorize all available forces to defend Axiom Prime. That includes your vessel, Ambassador Price. May your warriors be as skilled as we fear they are." Daniel relayed the authorization to Admiral Carter and watched her expression shift from waiting to action. The Admiral's orders came fast and precise. "All hands to battle stations, weapons hot. Marines prepare for possible boarding actions." The screen shifted to show an external view as the human frigate changed course and accelerated toward the Krell fleet. The ship was small compared to the alien vessels, barely a tenth their size, but it moved with purpose and speed that the Council ships lacked. Jake stood at the tactical display coordinating with the Admiral, his Marine training evident in every word. He identified weak points in the Krell formation, suggested attack vectors that would minimize the frigate's exposure, and prioritized targets based on threat assessment. Admiral Carter listened and implemented his suggestions without hesitation. The partnership between Navy and Marines was working exactly as it had been designed to work. The human frigate entered weapons range and opened fire. The railguns mounted along its hull spat out magnetically accelerated projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. The rounds hit 3 Krell ships in rapid succession, punching through their armor and causing massive internal damage. 2 of the vessels went dark immediately, their power systems failing. The third attempted to return fire, but its weapons tracked too slowly. Another volley from the frigate tore through its command section. 11 seconds after entering combat, 3 Krell ships were disabled or destroyed. The effect on the rest of the battle was immediate. The Krell fleet, which had been advancing methodically, suddenly hesitated. They had expected easy targets and passive resistance. Instead, they faced an opponent that shot back with deadly accuracy. Jake contacted the Council Defense Coordinator and offered tactical assistance. The coordinator, a being named Vex from a species that had not fought a war in 6 centuries, accepted immediately. Jake began issuing instructions to the Council ships, reorganizing them into a defensive formation that used their strengths while hiding their weaknesses. He positioned the Council vessels as mobile sensor platforms, using their superior detection systems to track Krell movements. The human frigate would be the sword, striking at targets identified by the Council's eyes. It was basic combined arms tactics, doctrine that human militaries had perfected over centuries. For the Council forces, it was revolutionary. The Council ships moved into position, and suddenly the Krell found themselves facing coordinated resistance instead of scattered defenders. Sergeant Kyle Murphy led his squad of Marines through the station's corridors, responding to breach alerts. The Krell had launched boarding pods at the lower levels, and Council security forces were being overwhelmed. Kyle's team moved with practiced efficiency, checking corners and covering angles as they descended toward the fighting. His Marines were young but well-trained, and they trusted each other completely. Corporal Alex Turner was on point, his rifle held ready and his eyes scanning for threats. Behind him, the rest of the squad maintained spacing and fields of fire. They had drilled these movements hundreds of times, but this was real. Kyle could hear weapons fire echoing through the station's passages, and the sounds were getting louder. They found the Council security forces in full retreat, running from something that made them abandon their posts. Kyle grabbed one of them, a being that looked like an upright insect, and demanded to know what was happening. The Council Guard's translator device struggled to convey the panic in its voice. The Krell were slaughtering everyone. Their armor was too strong and their weapons were too powerful. Nothing could stop them. Kyle released the guard and watched it flee down the corridor. Then he turned to his squad and his voice. The wounded were everywhere in the medical bay, and Dr. Lisa Cameron moved between them with steady hands despite her exhaustion. She had been working for 18 hours straight, treating injuries that ranged from minor burns to catastrophic trauma. The Council medical staff worked alongside her, their skills considerable but their experience with combat injuries limited. Lisa found herself teaching them how to prioritize triage during mass casualty situations, lessons she had learned during medical school from doctors who served in war zones. One of the council healers, a gentle being whose name Lisa could not pronounce, asked her how humans could inflict such terrible wounds on each other and then work so hard to heal them. Lisa looked at the Marine she was treating, a young woman who had lost her arm defending council civilians. Because we understand that violence is sometimes necessary but never desirable, we fight to protect, not to destroy. The Krell had withdrawn their boarding forces after Kyle's squad stopped their advance, but the space battle continued with increasing intensity. Admiral Carter's frigate was showing damage now, its hull scored by near misses and one entire section exposed to vacuum after a lucky Krell shot penetrated the shields. The crew worked frantically to seal breaches and reroute power, but the ship's combat effectiveness was declining. Jake watched the tactical display and knew they needed a new strategy. The frigate could not sustain this level of combat indefinitely, and the Krell were adapting to human tactics. He studied the enemy formation, looking for patterns and weaknesses. The Krell ships moved in a rigid hierarchy with the largest vessel at the center giving orders to the rest. It was a command structure that prioritized control over flexibility, and Jake recognized it from studying ancient Earth military history. Centralized command was strong but fragile. Cut off the head and the body stopped functioning. He called Admiral Carter and outlined his idea. The Krell flagship was the key to their entire operation. If they could disable it, the rest of the fleet would lose coordination. Carter listened and then asked the obvious question. How do we reach a target that is surrounded by 40 ships and protected by multiple layers of point defense? Jake smiled grimly. We do what Marines have always done. We improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Give me 6 hours and I will give you a plan.
The Admiral agreed and Jake got to work. He pulled together everyone with relevant expertise. Navigation specialists who understood orbital mechanics, weapons officers who knew the frigate's capabilities, and even a few council scientists who understood the local space environment. Together they began crafting something that was equal parts brilliant and insane. While Jake planned, Lieutenant Sarah Blake was preparing her fighter squadron for what might be a one-way mission. She had 4 pilots under her command, all of them veterans of humanity's small conflicts in the outer solar system. They were good, but they had never faced anything like this. Sarah gathered them in the frigate's cramped ready room and laid out the situation honestly. The plan required them to penetrate deep into enemy territory, mark targets under fire, and then escape through a closing window of opportunity. The odds of all of them making it back were poor. One of her pilots, a kid named Danny who barely looked old enough to fly, asked if they had a choice. Sarah nodded. Always, this is volunteer only. Every hand went up without hesitation. Sarah felt her throat tighten and had to look away for a moment. This was why she flew, not for glory or excitement, but for the privilege of leading people who would volunteer for impossible missions because someone needed to do them. Ambassador Daniel Price found High Counselor Orath in an observation room overlooking the damaged sections of the station. The ancient being looked tired in a way that transcended physical exhaustion. Orath spoke without turning around. We built this civilization on the belief that war was a primitive phase of evolution, something to be outgrown and forgotten. We were so certain that our way was the only path to true advancement. Now I watch my people die because we removed our capacity to defend ourselves. Daniel stood beside him and chose his words carefully. You removed war because you could. You had the technology and the time to evolve beyond it. Humanity does not have that luxury yet. We still live in a universe where violence exists, so we maintain the ability to respond to it. That does not make us primitive. It makes us practical. Orath turned to face him and Daniel saw something new in the alien's eyes. Respect. The counselor admitted that he had been wrong about humanity. They were not war-addicted savages. They were survivors who learned hard lessons and refused to forget them. Orath asked if humanity would help the council rebuild their defenses after this crisis ended. Daniel promised they would, but first they had to survive the crisis. He explained Jake's plan in broad terms, and Orath listened with growing alarm. The plan was dangerous and required precise timing and execution. One mistake would result in the destruction of humanity's only ship and the death of everyone aboard. But if it worked, they could end the battle decisively. Orath gave his approval and added something that Daniel had not expected. When this is over, Ambassador Price, I will personally sponsor humanity's full membership in the Council. Without restrictions. You have earned that right in blood. The plan began with deception, and Dr. Cameron found herself playing an unexpected role. She worked with council scientists to reprogram a dozen automated cargo haulers, making them broadcast the same energy signature as Admiral Carter's frigate. The council had ships that could mimic other vessels for search and rescue operations, and Cameron adapted that technology for military purposes. Each decoy would read as a human warship on Krell sensors, at least for a few minutes. 12 false targets and one real one, all launching simultaneously from different points around the station. The Krell would have to split their forces to intercept them all, and by the time they realized most were decoys, it would be too late. Cameron worked through the night making sure each cargo hauler was programmed correctly. She was a doctor, not a soldier, but this was how she could contribute to the fight, save lives by creating the conditions where fewer lives would be at risk. 0 hour arrived and Sarah's fighter squadron launched from the frigate's small hangar bay. They accelerated hard, pushing their engines to maximum as they headed toward a field of debris from destroyed ships. Sarah's plan was to hide among the wreckage, using the metal fragments to mask their heat signatures and radar returns. It was dangerous flying, threading between chunks of twisted metal at speeds that left no margin for error. Danny's voice came over the radio sounding nervous, and Sarah kept her own voice calm and confident. "Stay on my wing, match my maneuvers, and trust your instruments. We have done this in simulation 100 times. This is just a simulation with higher stakes." Her pilots followed her into the debris field, and Sarah felt her stomach clench as proximity alarms screamed warnings about imminent collisions. She flew by instinct and training, making micro-adjustments that kept her fighter from becoming another piece of debris. The decoys launched on schedule, and the Krell reaction was immediate. Their fleet split into multiple groups, each one moving to intercept what appeared to be a human warship. Sarah watched on her tactical display as the enemy formation came apart, creating gaps that had not existed moments before. She led her squadron through one of those gaps, emerging from the debris field behind the Krell lines. The enemy flagship was 3,000 kilometers ahead, a massive vessel bristling with weapons. Sarah armed her targeting laser and painted the flagship's weak points, locations identified by Jake's analysis of its design. The laser was invisible to normal sensors, but Admiral Carter's frigate could see it clearly. Sarah's voice was steady as she confirmed target lock. "Targets marked. You are cleared hot." Admiral Carter gave the order, and the frigate fired every missile it carried. 36 weapons launched in a ripple that took less than 5 seconds. The missiles accelerated toward the flagship, their nuclear warheads armed and ready. The Krell point defense systems activated, shooting down missiles with practiced efficiency. 30 went down, 31, 32. The defensive fire was intense and accurate, but it could not stop them all. 4 missiles penetrated the defensive screen and detonated within meters of the flagship's hull. The shaped nuclear charges focused their energy into directed jets of plasma that burned through armor like paper. The flagship's hull ruptured in multiple locations, atmosphere venting into space along with debris and bodies. Secondary explosions rippled through the vessel as containment fields failed and power systems overloaded. The great ship came apart in slow motion, breaking into 3 major sections that drifted away from each other, trailing fire and wreckage. War leader Thax died in the first explosion, his command center torn open by plasma that vaporized everything it touched. His last thought was confusion mixed with rage. How had these humans done this? How had they penetrated his defenses and struck with such precision? He had studied warfare for decades, commanded fleets in a dozen campaigns, and never faced an enemy this adaptable. The Krell were strong and ferocious, but humans were something else entirely. They were warriors who thought like scientists, soldiers who planned like chess masters, and Marines who fought wit. The message from Earth arrived with quantum encryption so secure that only Ambassador Price could decode it. He sat in his private office with the door locked, reading words that made his blood run cold. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring Krell communications, and the news was worse than anyone expected. The attack on Axiom Prime was not the main assault. It was a probe, a test to see how the Council would respond. The real Krell fleet, containing over 400 warships and carrying armies large enough to conquer planets, was gathering in a neighboring sector. They would attack the Council's core worlds within 6 weeks. Earth's government wanted to know if humanity should remain neutral or commit forces to defend beings who barely accepted them as equals. The decision would affect humanity's future for generations, and they were leaving it in Daniel's hands because he was the one who understood the situation best. Daniel called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Jake arrived first, his uniform still showing signs of the recent battle. Admiral Carter joined via video link from the damaged frigate, her face haggard from stress and lack of sleep. Dr. Cameron was last, fresh from the medical bay where she had been treating the wounded. Daniel shared the intelligence report and watched their reactions. Lisa looked horrified at the scale of the coming invasion. Beth Carter's expression hardened as she calculated odds and assessed capabilities. Jake simply nodded as if he had expected this news. The captain spoke first. "Ambassador, Earth is asking the wrong question. They want to know if we should help. The real question is whether we can live with ourselves if we do not. These people need us. That is all that matters." Admiral Carter agreed but added a practical concern. Her ship was barely functional and needed extensive repairs. They had expended most of their ammunition and lost irreplaceable personnel. Even if humanity sent reinforcements, they would be facing odds of 10 to 1 or worse. The Krell had been preparing for this war for 3,000 years, while humanity had been in space for less than a century. This was not a battle they were equipped to win. Lisa surprised everyone by speaking up with unexpected firmness. "Maybe we cannot win, but we can buy time for evacuations, slow the Krell advance, and teach the Council how to defend themselves. Sometimes winning is not about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it is about saving as many lives as possible while making the enemy pay for every meter of ground they take." Daniel looked at his team and felt pride mixed with fear. They were ready to risk everything for people who had called humans too violent just weeks ago. He composed his response to Earth, choosing words that he hoped would convey the moral weight of the decision. Humanity had a chance to define itself on the galactic stage, to show that their history of conflict had taught them when to fight and why. If they abandoned the Council now, they would be safe but alone. If they committed to this war, millions might die, but humanity would become something more than a single species hiding in their home system. They would become protectors, the ones who stood between evil and innocence regardless of the cost. Daniel recommended full military intervention and sent the message knowing that whatever happened next would change humanity forever. The response came back in less than an hour. Earth was sending the fleet. Every available warship, 15,000 Marines, and enough supplies for an extended campaign. Humanity was going to war. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Admiral Gregory Hunt arrived with the Earth Defense Fleet, 47 warships ranging from frigates to heavy cruisers. Greg was a legend in human space, a man who had fought in every major conflict since the Mars Rebellion. He was in his 60s but moved with the energy of someone half his age. His first meeting with the Council War Committee was memorable. The Council members outlined their defensive strategy, which involved fortifying core systems and abandoning the outer colonies to their fate. Greg listened politely and then told them in clear terms that his Marines did not abandon civilians. Every world would be defended, every population protected, or he would withdraw human forces and let the Council face the Krell alone. The Council quickly changed their plans. Colonel Nina Garcia commanded the Marine Ground Forces, and she brought a philosophy that put her immediately at odds with Council thinking. The Council wanted to evacuate populations ahead of the Krell advance. Nina wanted to defend them in place. She argued that running only delayed the inevitable and demoralized the people they were supposed to protect. Better to stand and fight to show the Krell that every world would cost them dearly. High Counselor Arath worried that this approach would lead to massive casualties. Nina's response was blunt. "Casualties are inevitable in war. Our job is not to avoid them, but to make sure they matter. Every world we defend is time for others to prepare. Every Krell ship we destroy is one less threat to somewhere else. We trade space for time and blood for victory." It was brutal logic, but it came from someone who had spent her life studying how to win battles against superior forces. The Krell arrived exactly when intelligence predicted they would, their massive fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vega sector. Their first target was Kepler's Hope, an agricultural world with 6 million civilians and minimal defenses. The planet produced food for a dozen nearby systems, and its loss would create famine across the region. The Krell knew this and hit it first to maximize psychological impact. Colonel Garcia had 5,000 Marines on the ground and orbital support from a dozen human warships. Against her, the Krell deployed 50,000 ground troops backed by orbital bombardment from their fleet. The odds were suicidal, But Nina had not become a colonel by worrying about odds. She deployed her forces across the planet's 3 major continents, establishing defensive positions at choke points and urban centers. Every Marine knew they were massively outnumbered. None of them cared. The battle for Kepler's Hope became the defining moment of the war. The Krell landed their armies expecting quick victory, but the Marines made them fight for every meter. Sergeant Kyle Murphy commanded a reinforced platoon defending the capital city's main approach. His position was hit by 3 Krell assaults in the first 6 hours, each one larger than the last. Kyle's Marines used every trick in the book, setting ambushes, falling back to prepared positions, and inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. Corporal Alex Turner distinguished himself during the second assault, holding a critical intersection alone for 15 minutes, while his squad evacuated wounded civilians. The young Marine took 3 hits and kept fighting, his rifle empty but his sidearm still firing when reinforcements arrived. Kyle put him in for a medal and knew that if they survived this, Alex would never again doubt his place among the Corps. Above the planet, Admiral Hunt orchestrated a naval battle that would be studied in military academies for decades. The human fleet was outnumbered 4-1, but Hunt used every advantage he had. The Council ships provided sensor coverage and electronic warfare support, while human vessels delivered the firepower. Hunt employed tactics from Earth's naval history adapted for 3-dimensional space combat. He divided the Krell fleet through feints and ambushes, concentrated fire on isolated targets, and refused to let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. The Krell kept waiting for the humans to make a mistake. The mistakes never came. Hunt had been fighting battles since before some of his captains were born, and he knew that winning was not about having more ships. It was about using the ships you had better than the enemy used theirs. Jake, now promoted to major and serving as Hunt's tactical officer, identified a pattern in the Krell fleet movements. The enemy commander was keeping his flagship mobile, never staying in one location long enough to be targeted. But his movements followed a predictable pattern, cycling through systems with major communication hubs to maintain fleet coordination. Jake plotted the pattern on a star chart and made his prediction. The Krell commander would be in the Vega system in 48 hours. Hunt looked at the projection and then at Jake. If you are wrong, we lose ships we cannot afford to lose. If you are right, we end this war. Jake met his admiral's eyes without flinching. Sir, I am right. Hunt made the decision that defined his career. He stripped forces from defensive positions across the sector and concentrated everything on Vega. It was the biggest gamble of the war. The human fleet jumped into Vega system and found exactly what Jake predicted. The Krell command ship sat in high orbit around the system's primary planet, surrounded by escorts but vulnerable. Hunt's vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel, practically on top of the enemy formation. The surprise was complete. The Krell had seconds to react, and it was not enough. The human fleet opened fire with everything. Missiles and railguns and energy weapons all firing simultaneously. The space around the Krell flagship became a killing zone of overlapping fire. The enemy escorts tried to shield their commander, but there were too many attacks coming from too many directions. The flagship's shields collapsed under the barrage, and its hull ruptured in dozens of places. Secondary explosions rippled through the massive vessel as internal systems failed. Grand Warlord Kraxus commanded the Krell forces from his flagship, and he was a far more capable lead. The memorial park on Axiom Prime was finished 3 months after the war ended, and Daniel walked through it on a quiet morning when few others were present. The park occupied space that had once been a commercial district, destroyed during the Krell boarding action, and rebuilt as a place of remembrance. Trees from a dozen different worlds grew here, their leaves and branches representing the diversity of species that called the council home. At the center stood a statue that made Daniel stop every time he saw it. The figure was a human Marine in combat gear, rifle held ready but pointed down, standing watch over the paths where council beings walked in safety. The sculptor had captured something essential about the Corps, the balance between lethal capability and protective duty. The inscription at the base was written in 50 languages, but the English version read simple and clear. They came as diplomats. They stayed as warriors. They left as legends. They will return as brothers. Below the main inscription was a smaller plaque added by the Marine Corps themselves. The Latin words were translated for those who did not know them, but Daniel had memorized them in both languages. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It was more than a motto. It was a promise that Marines kept regardless of circumstances or cost. Daniel stood before the statue and thought about the people who died keeping that promise. 5 Marines at Axiom Prime, 2 pilots in the space battle, and over 2,000 more in the campaign that followed. Every one of them had volunteered to stand between danger and innocence, and every one of them paid the price that warriors have paid since the beginning of human history. Daniel wondered if the Council truly understood what they were seeing in this statue. Not a celebration of violence, but a memorial to those who carried violence as a burden, so others would not have to. Dr. Lisa Cameron found him there, and they walked together through the park in comfortable silence. Lisa had stayed on Axiom Prime to help establish medical protocols for the new Defense Force, teaching Council healers how to treat combat trauma and manage mass casualty situations. She looked tired but satisfied with her work. Lisa told Daniel that the Council species were learning faster than she expected, their natural intelligence and dedication helping them overcome their lack of experience. But they still struggled with the psychological aspects of warfare, the stress and fear and moral weight that soldiers carried. Lisa had brought in human counselors and psychiatrists to help with that, people who understood how violence affected the mind. The Council was discovering that preparing for war meant more than just weapons and tactics. It meant preparing people to face things that most beings never wanted to see. They reached a section of the park dedicated to individual memorials, small markers for each being who died defending the station. Lisa stopped at one marker and Daniel saw the name inscribed there. Lieutenant Sarah Blake, United States Marine Corps, who flew into death with courage and brought her people home. Below the name was a quote that Sarah's family had chosen. She flew not for glory, but for those who could not fly themselves. Daniel remembered Sarah's face during the briefing before her final mission, the calm acceptance of risks that would terrify most people. Pilots were a special kind of crazy, Jake had told him once. The good kind of crazy that meant they could do impossible things and make them look routine. Sarah had been that kind of pilot, and the galaxy was poorer for losing her. Admiral Gregory Hunt was settling into his new role as commander of Galactic forces, with the same pragmatic efficiency he brought to everything. Daniel met with him weekly to discuss the progress of building a real defense structure for the Council. Greg was blunt about the challenges. The Council had resources and technology, but lacked the institutional knowledge of how to organize military forces. They had no doctrine, no training standards, no logistics system designed to support combat operations. Everything had to be built from scratch using human experience as the template. Greg was importing instructors from Earth's military academies, establishing training facilities on multiple worlds, and working with Council engineers to design warships that could actually fight. It was the work of decades compressed into months, and Greg admitted he was not sure they could do it. But they had to try because the Krell were not the only threat in the galaxy. Jake Morrison, now Colonel Morrison, commanded the training command responsible for turning Council beings into soldiers. Daniel visited the facility on the outskirts of Axiom Prime and watched as Jake drilled the first class of Defense Force recruits. The beings came from 30 different species, and Jake treated them all exactly the same, with high expectations and zero tolerance for excuses. Daniel watched a particularly challenging exercise where recruits had to coordinate movement under simulated fire. Most of them struggled badly, their instincts fighting against the training. But they kept trying, and Jake kept teaching, his patience infinite when it came to people who genuinely wanted to learn. After the exercise, Jake gathered the recruits and delivered a lesson that Daniel thought summarized everything humanity was trying to teach the Council. War is terrible and destructive and should be avoided whenever possible. But sometimes avoiding war means preparing for it so thoroughly that enemies choose not to fight. That is what we are building here. Not an army of conquest, but a force of deterrence. You will learn to fight so well that fighting becomes unnecessary. Sergeant Kyle Murphy had been promoted to gunnery sergeant and assigned as Jake's senior enlisted advisor, responsible for the practical training that turned theory into skill. Kyle had a gift for reading people and adapting training to their needs. He was tough when they needed toughness and encouraging when they needed confidence. Daniel watched him work with a young Council recruit who was struggling with weapons handling. The being species had never held tools designed to harm others, and their cultural conditioning made even touching a rifle difficult. Kyle spent an hour with them, explaining that the rifle was not evil. It was a tool, and tools had no morality. What mattered was the person holding it and why they chose to use it. By the end of the session, the recruit could handle the weapon competently and, more importantly, understood that being a warrior meant accepting responsibility for the power to harm others. Kyle caught Daniel watching and gave him a tired smile. "This is harder than combat, sir. In combat, you know who the enemy is. Here, the enemy is fear and cultural conditioning. But we are winning one recruit at a time." Corporal Alex Turner had been promoted to sergeant and given a squad of his own, a mix of human Marines and council recruits learning to work together. Daniel joined them during a field exercise and saw how much Alex had grown since that first battle. The young Marine who had been nervous and uncertain was gone, replaced by a confident leader who knew his job and did it well. Alex ran his squad with the same professional standards that Kyle had taught him, firm but fair and always focused on the mission. During a break in the exercise, Daniel asked Alex if he ever regretted volunteering for this assignment. Alex looked surprised by the question. "Sir, I get to help build something that might prevent wars. I get to teach people how to protect themselves and others. This is exactly what I joined the Corps to do. Not everyone gets that chance. I am not going to waste it." High Counselor Orath had become an unexpected friend to Daniel over the months following the war. They met regularly to discuss not just policy but philosophy, exploring the differences between human and council thinking. Orath admitted that the council had made a fundamental error in believing that peace could be achieved by removing the capacity for war. True peace, he now understood, required the wisdom to know when to fight and the strength to do so effectively. The council had neither wisdom nor strength because they had deliberately forgotten both. Humanity remembered, and that memory had saved countless lives. Orath asked Daniel if humans ever regretted their violent history. Daniel thought carefully before answering. "We regret the wars and the suffering they caused. But we do not regret the lessons they taught us. Every conflict showed us the cost of violence and the value of peace. We learned to appreciate civilization because we know how fragile it is. The council never learned that lesson because they never faced the risk of losing everything. Maybe that is changing now." The first graduating class of the Defense Force held their ceremony in the main assembly hall of Axiom Prime, and the symbolism was deliberate. This was where the council had once debated whether humans were too violent to join galactic civilization. Now it hosted a ceremony celebrating the transformation of council beings into warriors, trained by those same humans. Daniel sat with the other dignitaries and watched as 200 recruits from across council space received their certifications. They wore uniforms that combined council and human design elements, a visual representation of the two cultures working together. Admiral Hunt delivered the commencement address, and his words were simple but powerful. "You are the first, but you will not be the last. You are building something new, a military force dedicated not to conquest but to protection. Remember always that your job is to defend those who cannot defend themselves. That is the highest calling any warrior can have." After the ceremony, Daniel found himself standing with Jake and Lisa looking out